The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it was screaming about. A single ship, unarmed, unescorted, had crossed the outer beacon line of the Threll checkpoint without slowing down. Every light on my board turned red at once. In 400 years of service, I had never seen a vessel ignore the beacon line. Ships that did that were usually destroyed within minutes by the automated defense grid. This one was not destroyed. It simply kept flying, as if the grid did not exist, as if 400 years of imperial law meant nothing at all. My name is Vresh Kalathos 9, and on that day I was a sub-administrator of the Threll checkpoint, a small but proud post at the edge of imperial space. My task was simple. Every new species that entered our territory had to be processed, cataloged, and if necessary, taught its place. This had worked for over 1,000 years. Species after species had come to us in fear, in awe, in desperate hope of mercy. We had built an empire on that fear. It was the foundation beneath every wall of every station I had ever served on. That morning, the foundation cracked, and I did not even notice it happening until it was far too late to stop. The ship that crossed the beacon line was small, boxy, and painted a dull gray that seemed almost apologetic. It did not look like a warship. It did not look like anything special at all. When my scanners finally caught up with it, the readout gave me a single word for its origin: Earth. I had heard of Earth before. It was a minor entry in our records, a species called human, recently discovered, not yet formally processed. According to protocol, any unprocessed species entering restricted space was to be intercepted immediately and given a formal warning, followed by a formal punishment if the warning was ignored. I sent the warning myself. My voice, translated into what our systems believed to be a human language, crackled across the comm channel with all the weight of imperial authority behind it. You have entered restricted imperial territory without clearance. Reduce speed immediately and prepare to be boarded, or you will be met with lawful force. There was a pause. Then a voice answered, calm, almost bored, belonging to a man who introduced himself as Daniel Cole. Yeah, sorry about that. We saw the beacon, but our translator flagged your warning as spam 3 times before it let it through. Can you send us the actual paperwork for entering your space? We would rather do this properly than get shot at by mistake. I remember staring at my console for a long moment, waiting for the joke to reveal itself. There was no joke. The ship continued at the same speed, its course steady, its tone entirely unbothered by the fact that I had just threatened it with lawful force. I checked our defense grid status. It was armed and ready. I could have ended that ship in under 6 seconds, and yet something in the calm of that voice made me hesitate, because it did not sound like defiance. It sounded like mild irritation, the same tone I might use if a food dispenser in the staff hall was out of order again. I requested clearance from my superior, Administrator Threll, and he ordered me to hold fire and demand identification through official channels. This, at least, still felt familiar. I transmitted the standard first contact packet, 400 pages of imperial law, species classification forms, and a formal declaration of submission that every new species was required to sign before being allowed to proceed further into our territory. Daniel Cole's reply came back within minutes. We looked at your forms. A few notes. Section 12 asks us to declare our species as either subordinate, tributary, or vassal. We are none of those. Section 40 asks for a blood sample to confirm biological inferiority ranking. We are not doing that. Also, your formal declaration of submission has a spelling mistake in the second paragraph. The word sovereign is missing a letter. Might want to fix that before you send it to the next species. Looks unprofessional. I read that message 3 times. I checked the document myself. The word was, in fact, misspelled. It had been misspelled for over 60 years, copied and reused across 10,000 identical forms, and no one, in all that time, had ever pointed it out to us, because no one had ever dared to read our sacred documents closely enough to criticize them. Administrator Threll ordered me to escalate. This was no longer a matter for a checkpoint officer. He summoned a small delegation ship and prepared to meet the humans in person, at the very edge of the checkpoint, where our authority was most visible and most absolute. I was assigned to accompany him as translator and record keeper. I remember feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Fear, yes, but also a strange excitement, the kind you feel before witnessing something that will be remembered. The human vessel powered down its engines and allowed us to dock alongside it, which was itself unusual. Most species, when finally cornered by an imperial delegation, either surrendered completely or attempted a desperate act of resistance. The humans did neither. They simply opened their airlock and waited. Daniel Cole met us personally. He was of average height for his species, with short brown hair and tired eyes, dressed in a simple gray uniform with no rank insignia that I recognized. Beside him stood a woman named Laura Bennett, who carried a small data pad and seemed far more interested in it than in either of us. Administrator Threll began with the traditional greeting, the one reserved for first contact with primitive species, a long and carefully worded speech about the glory of the Empire, the honor of being noticed by it, and the wisdom of accepting one's place within its structure. I translated every word faithfully. Daniel Cole listened politely for almost 2 minutes before raising a hand. "Sorry to interrupt. Is there a shorter version of this? We have a supply run scheduled and we are already behind." Administrator Threll stopped mid-sentence. I do not think anyone had ever interrupted him before, not in 300 years of service. He recovered quickly, as any good administrator would, and asked Daniel Cole directly whether he understood the severity of the situation, whether he understood that his species now stood before the might of an empire that had conquered and absorbed over 600 worlds. Daniel Cole nodded, though his expression did not change. "I get that this is a big deal for you. Honestly, we are not trying to be rude. We just have a lot going on right now. There is a mining dispute back home, a shipment delay on the far side of our system, and my daughter has a school event tonight that I am already going to miss because of this meeting. If there is a simple way to sort this out, forms, fees, whatever your system requires, we are happy to look at it. We just cannot spend the next 3 days on ceremony." I watched Administrator Threll's expression carefully. I had served under him long enough to recognize every shade of his anger, his pride, his satisfaction. What I saw now was none of those things. It was confusion, plain and total, the look of someone trying to solve an equation that refused to balance no matter how many times he checked it. He tried once more, invoking the name of the God Emperor, the sacred ruler of all imperial territory, whose word was law across 600 worlds, and whose mere mention had, on prior occasions, caused entire delegations to kneel without being asked. Daniel Cole's only response was to ask, quite sincerely, whether the God Emperor had a customer service department, because if this checkpoint process was any indication of how the Empire generally operated, someone up the chain might want to know that things were running a little slow. I do not believe Administrator Threll had words prepared for that question. I certainly did not. We spent the following hours attempting every approach our training had given us. Threll offered generous terms of tribute, expecting the humans to be grateful. Daniel Cole asked for the terms in writing, read them carefully, and then negotiated 3 separate clauses down as though he were haggling over the price of fuel, rather than accepting the mercy of an empire. Threll threatened consequences for non-compliance, expecting fear. Daniel Cole asked what specific consequences, listed his concerns about each one calmly, and pointed out that 2 of the threatened punishments would violate what he called basic decency, a concept he explained without any anger at all, simply as a fact he assumed we would already understand. By the end of that day, we had not conquered Earth. We had not even successfully frightened its representative. What we had instead was a stack of counter-proposals, a corrected copy of our own submission form, and a request, politely worded, for a formal meeting between our council and what Daniel Cole called Earth's actual diplomatic office, since apparently he himself was only a supply logistics coordinator and not authorized to make decisions of this scale. I flew back to the checkpoint that night beside Administrator Threll, and neither of us spoke for a long while. Finally he asked me a question that I have thought about every day since. "Vresh, Do you think they understand what we are? I told him the truth, because I did not know how else to answer. I do not think they have decided to find out yet. He nodded slowly, staring out at the stars, and said nothing more. I filed my official report that night, describing the encounter in careful, measured imperial language, the kind meant to avoid alarming anyone above me. But privately, in my personal log, I wrote something closer to what I actually believed. I wrote that we had just met a species that did not seem to know it was supposed to be afraid of us, and worse, one that seemed entirely unbothered by learning that it should be. I did not know it yet, but that single misspelled word in our sacred submission form was only the first thing about our empire that the humans would quietly, calmly, and without any apparent malice, begin to take apart. The correctional fleet left dock 11 days after my report reached the High Council, and I was ordered to accompany it as an observer, since I was, by accident of circumstance, the closest thing the Empire had to a human specialist. 11 days was, by our standards, an extremely fast response. Usually a species that failed to show proper submission was given several months to reconsider before any fleet was mobilized. But something about the report from the Threll checkpoint had unsettled the Council enough that they wanted the matter resolved quickly, before word of it spread to other subject worlds. The fleet itself was a magnificent sight. 60 warships arranged in the traditional formation used for what our doctrine called a correctional action, a controlled and highly visible show of force, intended to remind a defiant species of its place, without requiring the Empire to commit to a full war. I had seen this formation used twice before, against 2 different species, and both times it had ended the same way, with surrender within hours and centuries of quiet obedience afterward. Fleet Commander Doss, a tall and imposing figure with 3 centuries of successful campaigns behind him, briefed the officers before we crossed into human space. He explained that our target was a colony called New Aldrin, a modest human settlement on the edge of their expanding territory, chosen specifically because it was far enough from Earth to prevent quick reinforcement, but important enough that its loss would send a clear message. I remember Doss's exact words because I wrote them down at the time, believing they would be remembered as the beginning of humanity's education in imperial law. By tomorrow, this species will understand fear the way every other species in this empire has learned to understand it. We crossed into the outer edge of human territory without incident. Our sensors detected no defensive fleet waiting for us, no minefields, no hidden weapons platforms. This, Doss assured everyone, was expected. Most species did not build serious defenses until after their first painful lesson. We continued toward New Aldrin, expecting to find a frightened population and perhaps a token defense force that we would dismantle within the hour. What we found instead was a customs station. It was small, unarmed, staffed by perhaps a dozen humans, and it sat directly in our flight path with a calm insistence that our 60 warships found almost impossible to process. A voice came over the comm channel, belonging to a woman named Ellen Marsh, who introduced herself as the senior customs officer for the New Aldrin approach corridor. "Good morning. I see we have a large group arriving today. Before you proceed further, I need each vessel to submit a cargo manifest and confirm you are not carrying any prohibited biological material. This is standard procedure for all incoming traffic, no exceptions." Fleet Commander Doss laughed, an actual laugh, the kind that came from 3 centuries of confidence that nothing a lesser species said could possibly matter to him. He informed Ellen Marsh, through the official channel, that this was an Imperial correctional fleet, that we were not subject to her local procedures, and that she should evacuate the area immediately for her own safety. Ellen Marsh's response came a moment later, still calm, still entirely unbothered. "I understand you believe you are exempt, but our system flags any vessel without a valid manifest as a biological risk, and unfortunately that includes military fleets. I am required to hold your ships here until inspection is complete. This should not take more than a few hours if your paperwork is in order." Doss ordered the fleet to proceed regardless, treating the customs station as an obstacle beneath consideration. What happened next took every officer aboard our command ship by surprise. As our lead ships crossed the customs boundary, our navigation systems began reporting errors, minor at first, then increasingly severe. Course corrections that should have taken seconds began taking minutes. Communication between our vessels grew delayed and garbled. It was not an attack, exactly. There were no weapons fired, no damage done to any hull. It was something stranger, and in its own way far more unsettling. Our fleet had simply been quarantined, the way a shipment of fruit might be held at a border for inspection, tangled in a web of automated holds and flags that our own systems, designed to communicate with human infrastructure for the sake of the eventual conquest, were forced to obey because we had never anticipated needing to refuse them. It took our engineers nearly 6 hours to untangle the fleet from Ellen Marsh's quarantine protocols, and by the time we did, something had gone quietly, badly wrong with our lead ship, the Ash Crown, the largest vessel in the fleet and the personal command ship of Fleet Commander Doss. A cascading failure in its navigation core, triggered by the same automated systems that had delayed us, left it drifting, powerless, directly in the middle of what human traffic control called a shipping lane. I will never forget what happened next, because it was the moment I began to understand, truly understand, what kind of species we had encountered. A single unarmed cargo vessel approached the drifting Ash Crown. It was not a warship. It carried no weapons that our scanners could detect. Its captain, a man named Peter Hallow, hailed us on an open channel with the same calm, unbothered tone that Ellen Marsh and Daniel Cole had both used. "Hey there. Looks like your ship has lost power, and it is sitting right in the middle of the Aldrin shipping corridor. We have 3 cargo runs scheduled through here today, and honestly, this is a hazard. I am going to attach a tow line and move you out of the lane. It will not damage your hull. Standard procedure. We do this for disabled vessels all the time. Should only take about 20 minutes. Fleet Commander Doss, humiliated beyond anything I had ever witnessed in his presence, ordered every remaining functional ship in the fleet to prepare for immediate offensive action. It was at this point that something happened which I have turned over in my memory countless times since, trying to understand whether it was mercy, indifference, or something else entirely that I still do not have a word for. Just as Doss gave the order to open fire on the customs station and begin the assault on New Aldrin, every weapon system on every remaining ship in our fleet failed at once. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply failed, altogether, as though a switch somewhere had been quietly turned off. Peter Hallow's voice returned to the channel a moment later, entirely unaware of, or entirely indifferent to, the fact that he had just prevented what would have been the destruction of an entire colony. Sorry about that, by the way. Our system flags weapon activity near civilian shipping lanes as an automatic safety issue and temporarily disables the source until manual review. Should not have caught your whole fleet like that. That is actually a known bug we have been meaning to fix. I will file a report. In the meantime, your ship is clear of the lane. Have a good one. The Ash Crown was towed out of the shipping lane and left drifting quietly at the edge of New Aldrin's system, its weapons disabled, its commander speechless, its crew staring at each other in a silence that I can still feel when I close my eyes. No human vessel had fired a single shot. No human crew had boarded our ships. An entire correctional fleet, 60 warships strong, built and trained for exactly this kind of campaign, had been rendered completely powerless by a customs officer, a bug in a safety system, and a cargo hauler more concerned about a shipping schedule than about the empire it had just humbled. I was ordered to draft the official report of what had happened, and I remember sitting alone in my quarters for hours, trying to find a way to phrase it that would not sound like an admission of total defeat. In the end, I wrote the truth as plainly as I could manage because I believed, and still believe, that the Council needed to understand it clearly. I wrote that the humans had not fought us. I wrote that as far as I could tell, they did not consider what had happened to be a battle at all. To them, it seemed, it had simply been a busy day of routine work, made slightly more complicated by the arrival of an unusually large and unusually confused group of ships. Fleet Commander Doss requested reassignment following the incident, citing what our medical officers described as a deep and unresolved confusion regarding the nature of the encounter. I did not blame him. I felt something similar myself, a kind of dizziness that came from realizing the foundation I had built my entire understanding of the universe upon, the idea that imperial force was simply, inherently, overwhelming, might not be true anymore, if it had ever truly been true at all. I was summoned before the council myself, shortly after, the first time in my career I had ever stood in that chamber. Council Elder Voss, ancient even by the standards of our long-lived species, asked me directly whether I believed the humans had deliberately embarrassed us, whether this had been a calculated act meant to test our resolve. I told her the truth as I understood it. I do not believe they were trying to embarrass us at all. I believe they were simply doing their jobs, the same jobs they would have done regardless of who or what appeared in that shipping lane. I do not think they see us as an enemy. I am not certain, honestly, that they see us as anything more significant than an unusually large delay in their schedule. The chamber was silent for a long moment after I said this. I do not know what response I expected: anger, disbelief, perhaps an order to have me removed for suggesting such an unsettling possibility. Instead, Council Elder Voss simply nodded slowly, the way Administrator Threll had nodded on the night we first returned from meeting Daniel Cole, and said something I have never forgotten. Then perhaps, Vresh Kalithos 9, we have finally met a species that our empire was never actually built to face. 3 guards froze at the base of the Godspire staircase, their ceremonial spears raised, their faces hidden behind masks of beaten gold, and none of them knew what to do, because the woman climbing toward the throne of the God Emperor had just asked if there was somewhere nearby she could get a cup of coffee. I stood a few steps behind her, close enough to translate, close enough to feel the full weight of the silence that followed her question. Her name was Laura Bennett, the same woman who had stood quietly beside Daniel Cole on the day of first contact, and she had been chosen, apparently without much ceremony on the human side, to lead their formal diplomatic visit to the seat of imperial power. I had expected someone more senior, someone with more visible authority. Instead, Earth had sent a woman who traveled with a single datapad, wore a plain gray uniform, and seemed far more concerned with jet lag than with the fact that she was about to walk into the most sacred and most feared place in the entire empire. The Godspire itself rose above the capital world like a blade of pale stone, visible from orbit, built across 4 centuries by the labor of 100 conquered species, each stone laid as a tribute to the God Emperor's absolute and unquestioned authority. At its summit sat the great throne, and beneath it, carved into the floor in letters taller than any of the guards who protected it, was the single unbreakable law of the empire. Every being who entered the presence of the God Emperor must kneel, and any being who did not kneel would be ended without hesitation or mercy, regardless of rank, regardless of species, regardless of the consequences that might follow. I had seen this law enforced only once before, early in my career, against a delegate from a proud warrior species who had refused to kneel out of principle, choosing instead to stand tall and accept his fate as a final act of defiance. It had been swift, and it had been remembered for a generation as proof that no one, absolutely no one, was above the sacred order of the empire. I fully expected the humans to either kneel out of caution or refuse out of pride, and I had spent the entire journey to the capital preparing myself for either outcome. What I had not prepared myself for was the third possibility, the one that actually occurred, which was that Laura Bennett simply did not seem to register the ritual as something happening to her at all. We climbed the long staircase together, thousands of steps carved from black stone, each one etched with the names of species that had bowed before this throne across the centuries. Laura Bennett read some of the names aloud as we climbed, commenting occasionally on the craftsmanship, asking me polite questions about the history of certain carvings, and checking her datapad twice to confirm the timing of a call she was scheduled to join later that day with someone she referred to only as her supervisor back on Earth. When we reached the top, the guards lowered their ceremonial spears in the traditional signal that meant kneel now or be ended, a gesture so old and so absolute that I had never once seen it fail to produce immediate compliance in the 10 centuries since it had first been recorded. Laura Bennett glanced at the guards, gave them a small polite nod as though greeting security staff at a building entrance, and continued walking forward, her attention still partly on her datapad, where she appeared to be reviewing notes for the meeting ahead. I felt my whole body go cold. I opened my mouth to warn her, to explain the law, to beg her to kneel before the guards interpreted her continued approach as final and irreversible defiance. Before I could speak, one of the guards, a young officer named Kess, whom I had trained personally 2 years earlier, hesitated. His spear wavered. I could see, even through the golden mask, that he did not know what to do, because the law had never accounted for someone who was not defying it. It had only ever accounted for fear, or pride, submission, or rebellion. It had never once considered indifference. Laura Bennett stopped a few steps from the throne, looked around the chamber with polite curiosity, and turned to me with a question that I have replayed in my memory more times than I can count. Is there somewhere I could get a coffee before we start? It has been a very long flight, and I would like to be at my best for this conversation. I translated the question exactly as she asked it, my voice shaking slightly, because I fully expected this to be the moment the guards finally acted, the moment the ancient law reasserted itself and ended everything. Instead, I watched something happen that I do not believe had occurred in this chamber in living memory. The God Emperor, seated upon the great throne, raised one hand, palm open, the signal for the guards to stand down. I had served the Empire for 4 centuries, and in all that time, the God Emperor had never once countermanded the sacred law of the throne room. I later learned, through quiet conversations with the palace staff, that this decision had not come from mercy or curiosity, but from something far more unsettling, a genuine uncertainty about what would happen if the guards acted and the humans responded in kind. No one, from the council down to the God Emperor himself, actually knew what humanity was capable of, and for the first time in the history of the Empire, that uncertainty outweighed the demand for tradition. Coffee was brought, prepared as closely as our kitchens could manage, from a recipe Laura Bennett provided herself, and the formal meeting began nearly 40 minutes later than scheduled, a delay that would have been unthinkable under any previous circumstance. I stood beside the throne as translator, watching the God Emperor, a figure I had only ever seen from a great distance, study Laura Bennett with an expression I can only describe as careful, searching curiosity, the look of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not match any shape he had encountered before. He began, as was traditional, by explaining the nature of imperial rule, the honor extended to species who submitted willingly, and the fate that awaited those who did not. Laura Bennett listened attentively, took notes on her datapad, and when he finished, she asked a series of questions that seemed to catch him entirely off guard. She asked about trade agreements, about existing treaties with other species in the region, about dispute resolution processes, about whether the Empire had any established framework for handling disagreements between equals rather than between ruler and subject. The God Emperor, a being whose every previous conversation with a newly discovered species had involved explaining terms of submission rather than negotiating terms of partnership, seemed genuinely uncertain how to answer. I watched him glance toward his advisors more than once, searching for guidance that none of them seemed able to offer, because none of them had ever needed to consider what it might look like to deal with a species as an equal rather than as a subject. Toward the end of the meeting, Laura Bennett asked one final question, delivered with the same calm, unhurried tone she had used throughout the entire visit. I understand your empire is built around the idea that every species eventually accepts its place beneath your authority. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty will serve us better than pretending otherwise. Earth is not going to do that. We are happy to trade, to cooperate, to solve problems together where our interests align. But we are not going to kneel, and I do not think it would help either of us if you spent the next century trying to convince us to. The chamber fell silent. I translated her words as precisely as I could, watching the reaction ripple across the faces of every advisor present, expressions of shock, of anger, of confusion, all fighting for space at once. I expected the God Emperor to respond with fury, to invoke the sacred law one final time and demand that the guards act regardless of his earlier hesitation. Instead, he sat quietly for a long moment, studying her, and then asked a question of his own, one that I do not believe he had ever needed to ask another species in the entire history of his reign. If you do not fear this throne, and you do not seek to challenge it, then tell me plainly, human, what is it that your species actually wants from mine? Laura Bennett considered the question carefully before answering, and her answer, simple as it was, unsettled the room far more than any threat or declaration of war could have managed. Mostly, we would just like to be left to handle our own affairs, and we would appreciate it if your empire stopped sending fleets to remind us of things we were never planning to forget in the first place. I watched the God Emperor's face as she said this, and for the briefest moment, I believed I saw something I had never once seen in the ruler of 600 worlds. Not anger, not offense, something closer to genuine, quiet worry, the look of a being beginning to understand that his empire had just met something it did not have the tools to properly measure, let alone control. We left the Godspire that evening, without a treaty, without a declaration of submission, without any of the outcomes that 4 centuries of imperial tradition had prepared me to expect. What we left with instead was an open invitation for further talks, extended not out of generosity, but out of something I recognized only much later as caution, the first genuine caution the Empire had ever shown toward a species it had originally intended to conquer within a single season. On the transport back to my post, I found myself thinking about Kess, the young guard whose spear had wavered at the top of that staircase. I understood, finally, what had frozen him in that moment, and it was the same thing that had unsettled every officer, every administrator, every commander who had encountered the humans so far. Our entire empire had been built upon the assumption that every being in the universe understood fear the same way we did, and could therefore be controlled the same way, through threats calibrated precisely to that fear. The humans understood fear too, I was certain of that. I simply did not yet understand what actually caused it in them, and neither, it seemed, did anyone else in the Empire, all the way up to the God Emperor himself. The trade routes to 3 imperial worlds went quiet within the same week, and it was Council Elder Voss herself who summoned me to explain why an economic blockade, one of our oldest and most reliable tools, had produced results that no one in the chamber could satisfactorily explain. The plan had been simple, at least on paper. After the meeting at the Godspire, the Council had decided that if fear could not move the humans, perhaps necessity could. Earth relied on several key trade agreements with border worlds under our influence, agreements that predated our formal contact with humanity, and that the Council believed we could quietly dissolve without triggering open conflict. Cut the supply lines, let hardship do the work that threats could not, and wait for humanity to come to us asking for terms. I was sent to observe the results firsthand at a mid-sized trading world called Denrath, one of the 3 affected colonies, because by this point I had become, somewhat unwillingly, the Empire's closest thing to an expert on human behavior. What I found there was not desperation. It was a woman named Grace Milton, the colony's chief logistics administrator, sitting calmly in her office, reviewing a stack of alternate supplier contracts with the same unhurried focus I had come to recognize as distinctly human. I asked her, through my translator, how her colony intended to survive the loss of its primary trade agreements. She looked up at me with an expression that was not worry, not defiance, but something closer to mild inconvenience, the same look I imagined she might give a delayed shipment or a scheduling conflict. Honestly, it is annoying, but we saw something like this coming a while back, so we already had backup suppliers lined up. It will cost us a bit more for a few months while things settle, but we will manage. Thanks for checking in, though. I returned to my quarters that night and reviewed every report the Empire had filed on human economic behavior since first contact, and a pattern began to emerge that I had somehow failed to notice before. despite having lived through several of its examples myself. Every time the Empire escalated, blockade, quarantine, formal threat, cultural pressure, humanity responded not with panic, not with anger, but with the same calm, practical problem-solving that Ellen Marsh had shown at the customs station, that Peter Hallow had shown while towing away our disabled dreadnought, that Laura Bennett had shown while calmly declining to kneel before the God Emperor himself. I began, out of a growing and somewhat uncomfortable curiosity, to study human history through what limited records our diplomatic office had managed to gather. What I found there changed the way I understood everything that had happened since the day that first small gray ship crossed the beacon line at Threll Checkpoint. Humanity's own history, long before we had ever encountered them, was filled with catastrophe on a scale that made our own imperial conquests look almost restrained by comparison. I read accounts of plagues that had killed a third of entire populations within a single generation, and yet trade routes had reopened, cities had rebuilt, and life had continued within a few short decades. I read accounts of ice ages that had reshaped their entire world, forcing their ancestors to migrate across frozen continents with nothing but the simplest of tools, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they had survived and multiplied anyway. I read of wars fought over disputes so small and so petty that our own historians would have struggled to justify them, wars that had nonetheless produced suffering and loss on a scale that rivaled entire imperial campaigns, and yet the species had endured every single one of them, learning, adapting, and continuing forward with what I can only describe as a stubborn and almost thoughtless persistence. Against a history like that, an imperial blockade must have seemed, to them, like little more than an unusually inconvenient season of bad weather. We had built our entire strategy of subjugation around the assumption that fear of hardship would break their will, without ever considering the possibility that hardship, to this particular species, was simply a familiar and expected part of existence, something to be managed and endured rather than something to be feared into submission. I brought this theory before Council Elder Voss, expecting to be dismissed, as I had half expected during my earlier report on Fleet Commander Doss's failed campaign. Instead, she listened carefully, and when I finished, she asked me a question I had not anticipated. If hardship does not move them, and force does not move them, and the presence of the God Emperor himself does not move them, then tell me plainly, Vresh, what does move them at all? I did not have a complete answer for her that day, but I had begun to gather pieces of one, drawn from careful study of what few human sources our office had managed to translate. I explained that humans seemed to respond most strongly not to threats against themselves, but to threats against those they considered vulnerable, their children, their elderly, their sick, and that even then their response was rarely panic, but rather a swift and focused determination to solve the problem as efficiently as possible. I explained that they seemed far more troubled by dishonesty and unfairness than by raw displays of power, and that Daniel Cole's complaint about our misspelled sacred document, which I had once dismissed as a strange and trivial detail, may have actually revealed something important, that humans measured competence and honesty as signs of trustworthiness, and were quietly, persistently unimpressed by grandeur that was not backed up by genuine substance. Council Elder Voss absorbed this information in silence, and I could see, even in her ancient and carefully controlled expression, something that looked very much like quiet alarm. It was around this time that reports began reaching the capital from other subject worlds within the Empire, worlds that had been under imperial control for generations, long enough that open rebellion had become almost unthinkable to their populations. A species called the Revel, conquered 3 centuries earlier and known throughout the Empire for their complete and unquestioning obedience, submitted a formal request through their local administrator asking whether the human system of negotiated trade agreements might be extended to their own territory as well. It was the first request of its kind in living memory, a subject species questioning, however politely, whether imperial rule was truly the only available arrangement. A second species, the Doth, whose homeworld had been reshaped over 2 centuries to serve imperial industrial needs, began quietly reducing their production output, citing supply shortages that our inspectors later discovered were largely exaggerated. When questioned, their administrators offered explanations calm and reasonable enough that no formal punishment could easily be justified. Explanations that reminded me, uncomfortably, of Ellen Marsh's customs procedures and Grace Milton's backup supplier contracts. I understood, watching these reports accumulate on my desk, that something had shifted across the entire empire, something far larger than the fate of Earth alone. For 1,000 years, our authority had rested not merely on our actual strength, but on the shared belief, held by every subject species, that resistance was simply unthinkable, that the Empire's power was so total and so absolute that questioning it would never even occur to a reasonable mind. Humanity had never resisted us in any way our doctrine recognized as resistance. They had simply gone about their business, calmly, competently, entirely unimpressed by our grandeur, and in doing so, they had shown every other species watching that unthinkable things could, in fact, be thought. I raised this concern directly with Council Elder Voss during our final meeting on the subject, and she confirmed that the Council had reached the same troubling conclusion independently. The danger humanity posed to the Empire was not military. It had never been military. Our fleets, our weapons, our centuries of conquest still represented genuine and considerable strength, strength that humanity itself had never once tried to match or challenge directly. The true danger was quieter and far more difficult to counter. Humanity's simple, persistent refusal to be afraid of us was slowly teaching every other subject world within our borders that fear itself was a choice, rather than an inevitable fact of existence. That night, I wrote in my personal log something I had never allowed myself to consider before, not even during the humiliation at New Aldrin, not even during the strange, unsettling audience at the Godspire. I wrote that I was no longer certain the Empire could survive contact with a species that refused, on every single occasion, to treat us as anything more significant than a minor and temporary inconvenience in the course of their ordinary lives. And for the first time in 4 centuries of loyal service, I found myself wondering whether that survival was something I actually wanted. The council chamber had never been this full in my lifetime, every seat occupied, every elder present, and the air itself seemed heavy with a kind of tension I had never felt within those ancient walls before, even during the worst crises of my long service. I stood at the center of the floor, summoned not as an observer this time, but as the Empire's single most experienced authority on a species that had, in less than 2 years, quietly unraveled 1,000 years of careful imperial doctrine without ever once raising a weapon against us. Council Elder Voss opened the session with a question that every elder in that chamber had clearly been waiting to ask for months, a question I had spent countless nights turning over in my own mind without ever reaching a satisfying answer. Vresh Kalathos 9, you have studied this species longer than any other being in the Empire. Tell us plainly, because we have exhausted every strategy our history has given us. What does it actually take to make humanity treat us as a genuine threat, rather than as an inconvenience to be managed around? I had prepared for this question, and yet standing there, facing the full weight of the council's attention, I found myself hesitating, because the true answer felt smaller and stranger than anything the chamber seemed prepared to hear. I do not believe there is a threshold of force that will accomplish what you are hoping for, I told them. I have studied their history at length, their wars, their disasters, their disputes both large and small, and I have come to believe that humanity does not measure danger the way we do. We measure danger by scale, by the size of a fleet, by the reach of an empire, by the number of worlds beneath a single throne. Humanity measures danger by something else entirely, something closer to intention. They do not seem to fear scale on its own. They fear cruelty without reason, and they fear those who would harm the vulnerable among them without cause. Everything else, it seems, they consider a problem to be solved rather than a threat to be feared. An elder near the back of the chamber, a stern and rarely spoken figure named Callum, interrupted with visible frustration, asking whether this meant humanity simply could not be controlled by any imperial method at all, whether every tool the Empire had built across 1,000 years of successful conquest was now, suddenly, entirely useless. I answered as honestly as I could, because I no longer believed there was value in offering the Council comfortable lies. I believe our tools were never actually useless. I believe they were simply built for a different purpose than the one we now require. Our tools were built to create fear where none existed naturally, in species that needed to be taught submission before they would offer it willingly. Humanity does not require that lesson, because they were never going to offer submission in the first place, regardless of what we did to encourage it. I do not believe force will ever produce the outcome this council is hoping for. I believe, if anything, the more force we apply, the more clearly we demonstrate to every subject world watching that our authority depends entirely on fear rather than on any deeper legitimacy, and that lesson, I am afraid, is the one humanity has been teaching the rest of the Empire since the very first day their ship crossed our beacon line. The chamber fell into a long and uncomfortable silence following my answer, broken eventually by Council Elder Voss, who asked the question I believe the entire room had been avoiding since the session began. Then what would you have us do, Vresh? Abandon 1,000 years of imperial tradition because a single species refuses to be impressed by it? I considered my answer carefully before speaking, aware that whatever I said next would likely be remembered, in one way or another, for a very long time. I would not ask the Council to abandon anything overnight. I would ask the Council to consider a slower, and I believe ultimately safer path. Humanity has shown us, again and again, that they respond well to honesty, to fairness, and to competence, demonstrated through action rather than through grand declarations. I believe if this empire wishes to survive contact with a species this vast, this capable, and this fundamentally unafraid of us, we must become the kind of empire that does not require fear to hold itself together. Not because humanity demands it of us directly, but because every other species within our borders is now watching closely to see what kind of empire we choose to be, now that fear alone is no longer guaranteed to work. I did not expect the Council to accept this argument easily, and indeed, the debate that followed lasted the better part of 3 full days, filled with objections, counter-arguments, and no small amount of genuine anger from elders who had spent centuries building their authority upon the very traditions I was now quietly suggesting we reconsider. But something in the room had shifted since the first reports from Threll Checkpoint, something that had been building steadily through the failed correctional fleet, through the strange audience at the Godspire, through the quiet unraveling of our economic blockade, and through the growing murmurs of curiosity spreading among subject worlds that had once seemed permanently and unquestionably loyal. In the months that followed, the Empire did not transform overnight, and I do not wish to suggest that our long history of conquest was somehow erased by a single council session. But slow changes did begin, quiet ones, the kind that rarely make it into official records, but that I, having lived through every stage of this strange encounter, was able to witness firsthand. Trade agreements with human colonies began to include genuine negotiation rather than one-sided terms of tribute. Correctional fleets were quietly retired from standard doctrine in favor of diplomatic delegations, staffed increasingly by officers who had studied, as I had, the strange and stubborn calm of human behavior. Even our sacred documents were revised. The misspelled word Daniel Cole had once pointed out finally corrected after 60 years. A small and almost embarrassing symbol of a much larger willingness, however reluctant, to admit that the Empire could, in fact, be wrong about things it had once considered beneath question. I met Daniel Cole again nearly 3 years after our first encounter at the Beacon Line, during a formal trade summit held on neutral ground between Imperial and human territory. He looked much the same as he had that first day, tired eyes, calm demeanor, though he greeted me this time with something that felt, unexpectedly, like genuine warmth rather than simple professional courtesy. "You know," he said to me over a cup of something the humans called coffee, which I had grown rather fond of during my time studying his species, "when we first got your warning at that checkpoint, half our crew thought it was some kind of automated scam message. Took us a while to realize you people were actually serious." I asked him, since I had wondered about this for years, whether humanity had ever actually been afraid of us during those early encounters. Whether the calm his people had shown was a performance meant to unsettle us, or whether it had been genuine all along. He considered the question seriously before answering, which I had come to recognize, over the years, as something humans did more often than most species I had studied, treating even casual conversation with a kind of quiet honesty that I found, more and more, that I admired. Honestly, we were not trying to unsettle anyone. We had just come through some rough decades of our own, back home, before we ever met you. Compared to some of what we had already survived together as a species, an empire showing up and demanding we kneel just did not really register as the scariest thing on our list that week. I think that surprised you all more than anything we actually did. I thought back as he said this to the young guard named Kess, whose spear had wavered at the base of the Godspire staircase, unable to process a defiance that had never actually been defiance at all, only a species too busy surviving its own long and difficult history to notice it was supposed to be afraid of ours. I thought of Fleet Commander Doss, humiliated by a customs officer and a cargo hauler more concerned with a shipping schedule than with the empire he represented. I thought of Council Elder Voss, sitting quietly in that crowded chamber, finally asking the question that 4 centuries of doctrine had never prepared any of us to answer. I do not know, even now, whether the Empire's slow transformation will hold, or whether some future council will attempt to return to the old ways once the memory of humanity's calm indifference has faded into distant history. What I do know, standing here at the end of everything I have witnessed since that first alarm screamed across my console at the Threll checkpoint, is that the greatest danger humanity ever posed to our 1,000-year empire was never their fleets, never their weapons, never any threat we could have prepared to face in the traditional sense at all. It was simply this. They arrived, they went about their business with a calm and stubborn competence, and in doing so, without ever intending to, without ever raising a single weapon against us, they showed an entire empire built on fear, that fear itself had always been optional, and that the vast and ancient throne we had all knelt before for 1,000 years had perhaps never truly deserved that kneeling in the first place. That, I have come to believe, is the quiet and unremarkable truth behind the day humans entered our empire and treated it, from beginning to end, like nothing more than a minor annoyance.